Chemical warfare. So if you were born in the 1900s, chances are you'll be enlisted as a soldier to fight in World War I. So now wars are generally very brutal and deadly affairs that kill millions of people. But just imagine if you were also hit with a giant cloud of poisonous gas that would leave your lungs and skin feeling like someone poured literal acid mixed with pepper and garlic on you. This was what chemical warfare was all about. Whilst you are busy in the dirty trenches trying to dive bullets and bombs, you'd suddenly start feeling like you inhaled a bucket of hot sauce, and before you know it, your entire battalion would literally choke to death on their own vomit and bodily fluids. Chemical warfare basically used toxic chemicals like mustard gas, chlorine gas, or nerve agents to incapacitate and kill their enemies. These toxic gases would mess you up by attacking your respiratory system, skin, and sometimes your sanity, leading to severe blisters, blindness, severe lung damage, and of course, death. The worst part of using chemical warfare to fight during a war was that it not only attacked your oppositions, but would also damage and destroy everything it comes across, including civilians, animals, and even plants. These things were not exactly known for their precision. Thankfully, after seeing the gruesome effects of chemical warfare during World War I, the world pretty much agreed not to use it anymore. So the 1925 Geneva Protocol officially banned it, with everyone agreeing that suffocating your enemies in a cloud of invisible poison was a step too far, even for war. Blinding laser weapons. If you've even got outside when it was really sunny and tried to look at the sun, then you'd know how impossible that act alone is. Now imagine if someone literally directly lights a beam even brighter than the sun's rays directly into your eyes. Sounds pretty horrific, but sadly this was exactly what blinding laser weapons did. The crazy part is that these weapons were specifically designed to cause permanent blindness. So if your eyes mistakenly came in contact with one, well then you're going to be needing one of these for the rest of your life. Now, while lasers have been very useful to the military because they can be used for targeting, range finding, and guiding other weapons to their targets, turning it into a weapon to target people's eyes basically crossed the line from tactical advantage to unnecessarily cruel. And honestly, getting permanently blind is not something anybody signed up for, even though the military is meant to protect and serve. Fortunately, it was banned as a war weapon in 1998. Cluster munitions. To put cluster munitions in perspective, imagine you're standing at the top of a staircase, holding a bag filled with marbles, and then you tear the bag, allowing the marbles to roll down the stairs and scatter everywhere. You see, cluster munitions are the military equivalent of dropping a bag of marbles on a staircase, except instead of marbles, you have tiny bombs, and instead of a staircase, you have a battlefield. These cluster munitions were designed to cover a wide area with explosives, turning one bomb into a party pack of destruction. Now the problem is that these things are notoriously unreliable. Not all the bomblets explode on impact. Instead, they just lie around, waiting to be accidentally triggered by a passing soldier, a curious child, or even a poor, unsuspecting animal. It's like leaving a bunch of mousetraps set all over your house and hoping for the best, which is not exactly a strategic move unless your strategy is total chaos and tragedy. The weapon was banned in the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions because they're a menace long after the war is over. Imagine going for a stroll years after the conflict has ended and accidentally stepping on one of these forgotten party favors, which is not exactly a fun surprise. Perfidy. Now, just imagine you're playing hide and seek with your friend and someone comes out and says, "I'm not hiding anymore," or "I give up," only for you to come out of your spot and get jumped by the same person who claimed to have stopped playing. That's exactly what perfidy is. But instead of a playground game, it happens in a war with way more consequences. They're basically swearing on their mom's life that they're done fighting, waving the white flag and all. But immediately you let your guard down, it's another attack. This dirty trick was so bad and deceitful because war was already a very chaotic and draining situation. So lying and tricking people to get them to lay their guards down was just plain evil. Sometimes perfidy can also involve some military groups who would even dress up as civilians or use civilian buildings. It's deceitful and tricky. This act could also endanger real civilians because soldiers might start seeing everyone as a potential threat. It's like everyone at the costume party being mistaken for the bad guy. It could lead to more unnecessary fighting and casualties. Well, thankfully, perfidy was formally banned by international humanitarian law under the Hague Conventions of 1907 and further reinforced by the Geneva Conventions of 1949. 1949. The truth of the matter remains, nobody likes being lied to. White phosphorus against civilians. You've probably had snow or ice against your skin. Now imagine instead of feeling something cold when snow or ice touches your skin, it feels like a red hot lava has been poured on you instead. That's basically how white phosphorus feels like when it touches your skin, but much worse. White phosphorus is a chemical that ignites when exposed to oxygen. Once it's airborne, it burns hotter than 1,000 suns. Okay, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but it does burn at about 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. As if it's not terrifying enough, it also produces a thick white smoke, which is great for creating a smoke screen on the battlefield, but not so great if you're, trying to breathe. This nasty stuff was the military's equivalent of a fire-breathing dragon, if the dragon was also a total jerk who didn't care who it burned. This substance isn't just banned for use against civilians, it's the stuff of nightmares for anyone who comes into contact with it. This stuff would literally stick to your skin and clothes and keep burning until it runs out of oxygen. The burns are deep, painful, and often fatal, and that is if you're lucky enough to survive the initial impact. Well, thankfully, it is banned under Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons because it's indiscriminate and causes unnecessary suffering. However, it is okay to use white phosphorus to illuminate a battlefield or create smoke to cover troop movements, but this is highly regulated, and when it comes to using it directly against civilians or in civilian areas, that's a big no-no. It's kind of like how fireworks are allowed on the 4th of July, but not in your living room. Poisoned weapons. Poisoned weapons are like the war equivalent of playing dirty, because nothing says fair fight like slipping a little something toxic into your enemy's drink, or, directly into their bloodstream. Think about it. While your opponent is busy dodging bullets and bombs, you decide to take a page out of the medieval playbook and literally apply poison to the tip of your knife or bullet, or dip arrows in venom. The aim here was not just to wound your enemy, but to ensure the wound was extra fatal, with a side of unbearable agony. The tactics of using poisoned weapons in war were later banned under the Hague Declaration of 1899 and later reaffirmed by the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993. Now, aside from being a particularly gruesome way to kill someone, poisoned weapons are the ultimate coward's move. And there's also the matter of the effects. Slow, painful deaths filled with convulsions, foaming at the mouth, and every other symptom you'd find in a horror movie about medieval torture. The horror and suffering caused by poisoned weapons are considered beyond what's necessary or acceptable, even in war. Hostage taking. So it's the middle of the Second World War and you're just a civilian trying to stay out of harm's way. But one evening, the enemy troops suddenly entered your town, raided it to the ground, and you and some other people were taken by the soldiers to use as an insurance policy. This is basically what hostage taking is about, from being an innocent bystander to being thrust into the terrifying role of a bargaining chip. It's not just civilians that are seized, but soldiers too. The enemy would hold them captive to leverage negotiations and make demands, or use them as human shields. It's like saying, I've got your people, so you better do what I say or else. It's not exactly a fair play, and is widely regarded as a desperate and cowardly move. The crazy part is that it is not just the captives who suffer. The fear of hostage taking can spread panic among the general population, making everyone's life a living nightmare. The international community saw this act as a classic case of violation of human rights, and as an appalling form of psychological and physical abuse. So they banned it in 1979 because it's just turning innocent people into pawns in a violent game they never signed up for, which often leads to horrific outcomes if demands aren't met. Scorched earth policy. Let's say you come back home from work one night and notice that your house is getting robbed. Instead of calling 911 or maybe fighting off the burglars, you just went ahead to set your house on fire to burn both the thieves and your house, so that the thieves won't leave alive and they won't take anything either. That's basically what the scorched earth policy is all about. Instead of retreating quietly from a battle, you decide to burn down everything in your path, like farms, homes, bridges, schools, livestock, and even entire towns. The goal is to leave nothing behind for the enemy to use. It's the ultimate, if I'm going down, I'm taking you with me move. It's an all-or-nothing approach that inflicts massive suffering on local populations, often leaving them without food, shelter, or resources to rebuild after the conflict. And that's not just bad for your enemies, it's bad for everyone involved, including your own side. Scorched earth policy is a military tactic that's less about winning battles and more about making sure there's nothing left to win or lose. And while it may sound strategic, it's actually a tactic of last resort. a kind of medieval version of flipping the board when you realize you're losing the game. The policy was condemned and banned by the Geneva Conventions, which emphasize the protection of civilians and prohibit unnecessary destruction during armed conflict. The idea is that wars should be fought between soldiers, not civilians, and definitely not the countryside. Terror bombing. So let's say there's an ongoing war in your country and you're in your hometown going about your day when you suddenly hear the air raid siren blasting. You look up to see that once clear blue sky has now been filled with enemy planes, and all of a sudden, bombs are literally falling out of these planes right into the heart of your city. It's like someone decided to rain down fire and broke stone literally, and soon the entire city is on fire. What you've just experienced is terror bombing, a military tactic that involves deliberately targeting civilian areas with the goal of breaking the enemy's morale and forcing them to surrender. The idea behind this tactic is if you make life miserable enough for the population by destroying homes, hospitals, schools, and infrastructure, then the enemy government will buckle under the pressure of a devastated, desperate masses. It's basically the, if we can't defeat their military, let's just traumatize everyone instead approach. The most significant episode of terror bombing during World War II was the dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, which forced the Japanese government to surrender 6 days later. After this unfortunate event, the Geneva Conventions and other treaties were formed to ban terror bombing because it's a blatant violation of international humanitarian law, specifically designed to terrorize civilians. War, brutal as it is, has rules, and one of the fundamental ones is don't make innocent people the targets. To find out more about all the crazy banned military tactics, all you need to do is join our Discord server today. Denial of quarter. So just imagine you're on this great battlefield, outnumbered, outgunned, and honestly totally gassed out. You don't even have the strength to lift your hands anymore. Talk more of lifting a gun to shoot at anything. So you and your comrades decide to do the sensible thing and surrender. So you toss your weapons aside, raise your hands, and fall to your knees, hoping to put a snooze button to the entire nightmare. However, the enemy commander looks at you and your comrades all defeated and starts shooting recklessly, which is basically cold-blooded murder at this point. Well, what just happened is called denial of quarter, and it is a military strategy that basically means that there is nothing like surrender or hostage taking. You either fight or you die. Now, even though denial of quarter sounds like a bad review on Amazon, it is actually a very brutal and merciless act of war. So even though you're waving white flags, tossing down their weapons, and pleading like a kid who didn't study for a surprise test, the other party's response is always the same: show no mercy and take no prisoners. However, because this military tactic is a blatant violation of the laws of war and an act of pure cruelty, it was banned under the Geneva Conventions and customary international humanitarian law, with the rule that combatants who surrender, are wounded, or are captured are supposed to get treated like actual human beings. You should give them medical care, good food, and maybe a warm blanket or two. Denial of quarter is even viewed as a war crime because it totally eliminates the possibility of surrender, forcing combatants to fight to the death, and often resulting in unnecessary loss of life on both sides. Pillage. So let's just imagine that you're a medieval peasant minding your own business on a peaceful Sunday afternoon. You've just finished harvesting your crops and you're about to enjoy a nice cup of ale when suddenly, out of nowhere, a group of soldiers comes barging into your farmland. They literally start taking everything by force: your crops, your livestock, your shiny new pitchfork, and leave you with nothing but your muddy boots. Well, this broad daylight stealing is called pillaging, and it is when soldiers loot and plunder everything they can lay their hands on in an enemy's territory. Now, as tempting as it might be for an army to grab anything that isn't nailed down, pillaging is banned as a military strategy because it is just plain unfair. Think about it. You're not even a soldier. You're a farmer who spends all day planting turnips, not plotting world domination, so why should you lose everything because some army is passing through? It's like being grounded because your sibling did something wrong. No one likes that, especially when you didn't do anything to deserve it. It's also really counterproductive and dumb because armies need supplies to keep going: food, water, and shelter. And if they pillage a town and take everything, what's left for them when they next pass through? It's like eating all your snacks during the first 5 minutes of a road trip. What are you going to munch on for the next 8 hours? Ultimately, pillaging is banned because it drags out conflicts, creates unnecessary hardships, and leaves you, the soldier, on the wrong side of history and the law.